This is the Good Morning Isla 200 show.
This podcast was prepared by the Fall 2023 cohort of Isla 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamic history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Good Morning Isla 200 show with your hosts Aleena,
Mia,
Andrew,
Sidrah,
and Rameen.
Today's guiding question is, how has the role of women in Islamic poetry evolved over time, from the pre-Islamic poetry era to contemporary Islamic poetry? We've decided to focus on 5 main periods throughout Islamic history: pre-Islamic history, the Islamic Golden Age, the Abbasid era, the Mughal Empire, and contemporary Islamic poetry.
All right, so we can start with pre-Islamic poetry, or poetry of the Jahiliyyah, which refers to the age of innocence before Islam. Qasidas were a popular form of poetry at the time, and in English are often translated as odes. They often incorporate some of the 3 following elements: so an expression of nostalgia for what once has passed, description of travel, as well as praise of a tribe or ruler. It's the consensus among many classical Arab scholars that the best examples of pre-Islamic qasidas were written by 7 pre-Islamic poets. And these works together are known as the mu'allaqat and were displayed on the Kaaba. So they were the hanging poems. We can't really talk about women and pre-Islamic poetry without mentioning Al-Khansa. So she was really renowned for her poetry, which was mainly composed as deeply felt laments for her brothers who were killed in battle. She took part in many great poetic tournaments, competing with and often defeating her male counterparts. And some even consider her the mother of Arabic poetry. Doing a survey of literature to see what scholars have found on the depiction of women in pre-Islamic poetry, some have identified main depictions of them as certain archetypes or images. So these are the beloved, the fertile female, the mother, and the respected and well cared for female. Some scholars even go so far as to say that this pre-Islamic depiction of women is in contrast to the contemporary depiction of Arab women, mainly in a Western context, which portrays them as hidden behind veils, voiceless, silent figures, or deprived of rights. So some even say that in pre-Islamic poetry, women are seen as desired and full of life and respected, which is in contrast to how they can be depicted in some contemporary Western portrayals. The poem we'll be going over is by Antara, who was the son of a black slave, and his main depictions of women focus on his niece Abla. He asked for her hand in marriage, but was denied it because he was the son of a slave. So we'll begin with reading some excerpts of his mu'allaqat. Casually, I fell in love with her as I slew her folk. By your father's life, such a declaration is scarce opportune, and you have occupied in my heart, make no doubt of it, that place of one dearly beloved and highly honored. But how visit her now her people are in spring quarters at Unaizatan, while ours are dwelling in Al-Galim. So this portion of the poem fulfills the nostalgia requirement of a qasida, but it also establishes his yearning for Abla as he describes the scene of her departure from her old home to her new one. So now we'll move on to the next excerpt of the poem. She takes you here with the flash edge of her smile, her mouth, sweet to the kiss, sweet to the taste, as if a draught of must from a specimen's pouch announced the wet gleam of her inner teeth, or an untouched meadow, bloom and grass, sheltered in rain, untrodden, dung-free, hidden. Over it, the white first clouds of spring pour down, leaving small pools like silver dirhams, pouring and bursting, evening on evening, gushing over it in an endless stream. The fly has it all to himself, and is not about to leave, droning softly like a wine drinker humming a tune, the buzzing elbow on elbow like a one-armed man kindling the fire, bent over the flint. So we can see that his depiction of Abla is really focused on nature. The metaphors are centered around animals, plants, and natural phenomena. We can see that there's an emphasis on physical beauty, sensuality, desire. There's almost even an element of reverence as he's comparing her to these great natural phenomena. Scholars have even noted that this emphasis on beauty and sensuality, as well as reverence, was pervasive in poetry of the time.
So in terms of the pre-Islamic era, how do you think women are represented? Like, in what do you think is it enough, or it should be more, or?
I think there's kind of maybe like two sides to that question. I think there is there aren't very many, but there was Al Khansa, who was a female poet, but her poems mainly revolved around men. And then as for depictions of women in poems written by male poets, they're usually, from what I've seen, like objects of desire. So it's about romantic love. There's an emphasis on physical beauty. For most part, obviously there are exceptions to this, but I think Antera's poem is pretty representative of the fact that, in large part, women in poetry were revered for their beauty and as romantic, like objects of romantic desire.
Okay, so then the next era of Islamic poetry we're going to be looking into is between 640 AD to 900 AD, which is also known as the Islamic Golden Age. And this era of poetry became sorry, can I restart? Yeah, I'm restarting. So the next era of Islamic poetry we're going to be looking into is between 640 AD and 900 AD, and this period is known as the Islamic Golden Age. And in this period, poetry became a very powerful tool to expressing Islamic values. It kind of marked a period of cultural flourishing where poetry became a mean of exploring the complexities of faith and Islamic civilization. So while qasidas typically remain the most popular style of poetry in this era, new forms and styles of poetry began to emerge. For instance, rithas began to gain more popularity, and rithas are a genre primarily written by women, which kind of goes to show the influence that women had on poetry and literature in this time period. So as Sidrah mentioned earlier, like there was Al Khansa, yeah, so basically in this time period, women began to add their own perspectives and experiences into poetry. And then in terms of the depiction of women in poetry, so kind of what we saw earlier in pre-Islamic poetry, where women were typically depicted based on their physical appearance and their beauty and figures of love, that kind of began to shift a little bit in this era, where women weren't just idealized for their physical attributes, but they were kind of celebrated for some of their contributions to society. And although they did continue to acknowledge women's physical beauty, Islamic poets in this era began to also recognize some of the women's intellectual spirits and social contributions. And one of the most popular poets during this time period was Rumi. He's one of the greatest and most celebrated Islamic poets. And his portrayal of women in this period kind of shifts away from the stereotypical depiction of women, and his gaze towards women is laced with mysticism. And you can see this in a lot of his different works. So I'm just going to say two quotes that are from different poems. So the first one is, "Woman is a ray of God. She's not earthly beloved. She's creative, not created." And another one is, "God is never seen immaterially, and the vision of him in a woman is the most perfect of all." So here he's calling women the closest to God's image of all of their creations. He kind of like praises them and views them for their power and their spiritual potential. And I think something important to take note here is by comparing women to God, he's attempting to give women a stronger validation in society. And in some of his other works, he talks about women as mothers and wives and daughters and lovers and celebrates their contributions. So not just like talking about their physical attributes. He said, we are born of love. Love is our mother. And so he focuses on women as mothers and role models and sources of inspirations. And while not all poets during this time period portrayed women in the same way, the way that Rumi did began to show a period of change, and it was very progressive.
So Mia, you happen to talk about kind of the way that Rumi was able to now in this time period speak more about the influence that women had in society and the strengths that they were bringing forward into society. But can you speak a little bit as to what women were allowed to talk about in poetry, and if they were allowed to now talk about their successes as women, or what if they were still kind of confined to speaking about mourning and like writing rithas and that type of poetry?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, rithas became more popular and more women started writing them. But yes, as you mentioned, they were kind of confined in what they were able to talk about. So they weren't able to like express like their social contributions. And like I guess like at this time period it kind of gave them like they were able to add their perspective in poetry, but at the same time they were confined to what they were writing about. So mostly they would write about rithas, which is about mourning, and like as Sidrah mentioned before, with the El Khansa poem, it was kind of those were the types of poems that they were allowed to write, which was like mourning about like death of like family and like loved ones. And so yeah, so they didn't have much, I guess, leeway into what they were writing about, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because it goes right into the poem that I have for today. So I'm reading a poem by Salma al-Yamamiyya, who is an Abbasid female poet who moved to Medina from Mecca after her husband passed away. And just a little bit of background about the Abbasid era. We are still in the golden age of Islamic literature and culture. During this era, classical styles of literature were still the most popular, and a standard High Arabic arose, giving the language of scholars one unified sound. During the Abbasid period specifically, poets were no longer exclusively aristocratic. Artisans, freed slaves, and people of non-Arab origin were beginning to join the literary scholars. And at the time, poetry was still largely made up of qasidas and rithas, but it began to shift and change with such variety and perspective. So to read the poem, who has someone to make them happy during nights long and short? If it weren't for hope, one would have died, and from what I see, the soul follows one's traces. Suffice what time has done, kept the hated one to become familiar with me against my will. You who left the shores of our meeting, my longing for you is beyond my description. You kept my eyes awake during our separation. My eyes have enjoyed no sleep after your departure. I sleep only to meet you in my dreams. Though the greatest of sins is a woman who lost her loved one and yet can sleep. And this poem is very clearly part of a ritha. It is a lament to, or a eulogy for a past husband. And I think it really speaks to the way women are expected to write and contribute to literature at the time. They were seen more as attached to their husbands, and their writing was designed to be sad and mournful, which continued to perpetuate this stereotype of women as emotional or hysterical. It holds a lot of similarity to Al-Khansa, and I think a really interesting line here is, though the greatest of sins is a woman who lost her loved one and yet can sleep. Because I think that portrays that women should be so attached and dependent on their husbands that they shouldn't be sleeping when they lose them. And if they do, it's almost seen as a disgrace to the husband and to the memory to not be mourning. So it shows that women are expected to mourn, and that's their perceived contribution to society at the time.
So I have a question about what you just said. I was wondering, how genuine do you think her mourning is in this case? I know it's something that we've touched on a little bit with Al Khansa as well, but I wonder if sort of these mourning poems are just a way for women to channel their emotions into art, and that men are kind of like the subject of this art, but yeah, I was just kind of wondering, do you think that this is like sort of a genuine expression of her mourning for her husband, or whether it's kind of just a way for her to write poetry and express her emotion through this art form?
I think that's a really interesting question. And in this case, I think although the mourning is most definitely coming from a genuine place, um, there is absolutely exaggeration. And like you said, it being one of the few art forms women were allowed to produce, they mastered it and added expression and beauty and depth to all of their words. So while I do think a lot of the mourning in Arita comes from the heart, I think it is absolutely given a lot of flourish and emotion in writing, because when confined to only this type of poetry, women got very good at expressing emotion and showing their mourning and their loss. And I think that this notion that they're being portrayed as hysterical more so comes from a modern perspective looking back, because scholars don't really agree today on whether or not they were actually emotional and hysterical, or if, like you had asked and like I've been saying, it was more for the art form that they were being so emotional, and that in reality they were composed people like everybody else. And I think that it just goes to show that as we look back, we have to take into account those perspectives from the past as well.
Now that we've looked at the Abbasid era, now we're going to move on to the Mughal Empire. And today we're going to be looking into the work of Zebun Nisa, who was born in 1638 and passed away in 1702. Just a little background on Zebun Nisa. She was a Mughal princess and the granddaughter of Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal. And one important fact that kind of shaped her writing was that she had to write under a male pen name of al-Makfi, and literally Makfi means the hidden one. And part of the reason she wrote under a pen name, a male one, was because her father was a very orthodox Muslim man who believed that like her work and poetry should not be something that was like out in public, which I think really kind of shapes the way that we see her work today. So her works, she had many works. She wrote what is called a diwan, which is an entire like collection of works under a single author. And some of her other works include Munis al-Ruh, Zeb ul-Munshaat, and Zeb al-Tafsir. And Zeb al-Tafsir was one of the first Quranic tafsirs written by a woman. And Zeb al-Nisa was a very well-educated woman, as her father paid for many tutors in subjects such as science, math, literature. Growing up, she was influenced by many of the best poets of the Mughal Empire in South Asia with Irani influences. She studied Persian, Arabic, Hindi, Urdu. So she's taking a lot of influences from a lot of different subjects, which I think also is really interesting in how it shaped her work. And I know we mentioned before a little bit about mysticism, which is also plays a large part in her work, because she herself was influenced by her paternal aunt and uncle into Sufism, which is very different than Orthodox Islam, which is what her father followed. Sufism is like the mystic sect of Islam, and you'll be able to see a little bit as I keep on going. Zeba Nissa also at the time was influenced by other religions, which is something that we haven't previously seen in poetry. In the poetry we've kind of discussed in the previous periods, because of how diverse the South Asian subcontinent is. She's influenced by so many different religions. So not only is her work inspired by Islam, but it's inspired by Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and so many other religions, which is very interesting. But I kind of want to focus on the idea that she writes under a male pen name. When doing a deep dive into her work, I read like about her first 50 poems in her divan, and something that I was kind of like looking into as I was reading up on her was if she was writing as a woman just under a male pen name, or if she was writing as a woman who was pretending to be speaking as a man. Because when she speaks about love, loss, and reverence, it's always kind of in respect to religion, so you can't really tell if she's directly speaking about herself as a woman, or like if she's speaking like she's acting like a man speaking about women in reference to like this love and this loss and this reverence, which is always tied to God. So I'm going to read her sixth poem from her divan, which is untitled. Awake, arise, my soul, for it is spring. Let the narcissus with its scent divine cast its bewitchment. Let the saki bring his idol, for indeed he worships wine. To the forbidden path, turn not aside, and tyrannous beloved, let thine eye look thy victims trampled in thy pride, who for a glance from thee would gladly die. Some pay their worships at the Kaaba shrine, some pray within the temple courts apart. But Makfi, think what secret joy is thine, to bear thine idol ever in thy heart. So as we can kind of see in this work, she kind of steps away from the previous periods within the golden age of only kind of writing about mourning and loss and like rithas, and we've moved to a more open-ended structure where women are more free to speak about other topics. And in this case, because of the outside influence that she was like the cultural influence of the Mughal Empire at this time, and the poets that she was influenced by, she spoke a lot about different religions, and in this case she mentions like Kaaba and like temples, which shows like the diversity of religions that she was raised with. And part of the idea of Sufism is the personal connection to God, and like the love that one person has in their relationship to God, and the idea that each person has their own specific path, which I think is really nice and interesting as a perspective, whereas before we've kind of seen previously in like specifically like the Islamic golden age where we're only speaking about Islam. And in her other poems she kind of will use metaphors from other Islamic events, like different prophets, to reference the ideas of love and loss, which I think was also very, very interesting. But yeah, that's it.
A question I have for you, Aleena, is that now that you have examined like the next time period after the pre-Islamic era and then the eras following that we have mentioned, in terms of the evolution of the portrayal of women, do you think from the eras that we have mentioned before, has the portrayal of women or their issues or anything like that has improved since then?
Yeah, I think women were given a lot more freedom as to what they were allowed to speak about. They're not as confined to speak about loss and like lamenting on loved ones who have passed away, kind of like a change from Andrew's period. which kind of women were kind of still confined to writing about laments, and women are kind of allowed to write about their the choices they want to make and like what they personally have interest in. I do think though it's kind of like a two-sided idea, because in the case of Zeb Nissa, she does have to write under a male pen name. But overall, during this time period, I think women were more free to write about what they wanted and their influence into society, which kind of is like what we talked about with Rumi and how he was able to, I think, write about what women were contributing to society. I think women are now obviously not to the same level as they will be, I think, in the future, but they're able to write about what they can contribute to society. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So the next era we have is the contemporary time period, which starts from the 1940s and onward. So in the contemporary period, we see a lot of work done by women poets compared to, for example, male poets, addressing the issues of women compared to the eras that we have mentioned earlier. So through the work that I've seen, like we can see that there is an improvement in terms of in fact there is I would say a staggering like a huge improvement since then in terms of their involvement in Islamic feminist poetry, which I don't think was much that common before. And so in that sense I would say there is a huge improvement. We see that feminism has come forth in new kinds in the Muslim world based on the many principles. So we see Muslim feminists continue to fight for the rights of women, moving on in the circle of religious principles and their cultural according to socio-cultural perspectives. Okay, so one of the poets that I found quite interesting was there was multiple female poets from Pakistan who I noticed, but there was one that stood out to me the most, which was Fahmida Riaz. Fahmida Riaz, she was born in 1946, which is basically around the beginning of the contemporary period. She's known as an Islamic feminist poet. She was also an Urdu writer, poet, and activist, and she has also written many books. Her work was sometimes seen as controversial during that time in society, as she had prevalent themes which were seen as taboo for women writers to talk about, because it's not something that was very women were vocal about. So the fact that she was able to do that, it was seen as quite controversial. So she wrote her poems during the 1960s, living in a country in the shadow of religious male-dominated narratives. And she kind of talks about the issues of emotion, self-sexuality as a woman in her socio-cultural context. So she has many poems. I'll just mention a few titles of a few, because I feel like they also have significance. So for example, she has a poem called Virgin. Another one is She is a Woman Impure. Another one is Woman in Salt. Another one is A Woman Laughing. So we see that from the titles we can already see that the poems are talking fully about just women and their struggles, and we don't really see that in the previous eras. We see so that's something that I think has improved. So one poem that I'm going to dive into is Four Walls and a Black Veil, and I'm just going to read it and then we'll talk about it in detail. So Four Walls and a Black Veil. Well, what shall I do, sire, with the black veil? Why do you bestow on me the great favor? I am not in mourning that I should wear it, to show the world my grief, nor am I sick, that I should hide my shame. In its dark folds stamp my forehead with the dismal seal. If I am not to impudent, sire. If you assure my life, may I tell you? Well, I'm just gonna read some parts because the poem is quite long. So next part would be listen to the heart-rending screams of those still naked beneath the veil. You must know them well, these maids. The hostage of women vanquished peoples, halal for a night, exiled at dawn. The slave girls who carried your blessed seed and brought forth children of half status only. Yet, was it not honor enough for them? The wives who wait their precious turns to pay homage to the conjugal couch, the hapless, covering girl child whose blood will stain your grey beard red. Life has no more tears to shed, it shed them all. In that fragrant chamber where for ages now, the sacrificial drama has played and replayed. Please, sire, bring it down. So a bit more emphasis on the last part of the poem. These four walls and this black veil, let them bless the rotting remains. I have spread my sails in the open wind on the wide seas, and by my side a man stands, a companion who won my trust. So at the beginning of the poem, we see that we already can see that women are depicted and seen as oppressed. So we see when there's a mention of a man, there is the use of word sire every time when referring to a male authority, and obviously that signifies the respect and dominancy attached to them within society for men, while as in contrast to when referring to women, there's the use of the words maids, slaves, and servants, which is obviously done purposely by the author to signify the difference for both genders. And this really shows that the women were very much limited to submissive roles to display their involvement in society compared to the men. Also, we see there's also the use of many metaphors that play a big role in constructing the identity of women. So the mention of four walls kind of signifies the boundaries that are ascribed to the women in the social, cultural, and religious context. So it kind of shows their limits of participation in the public spheres. And the four walls represent the limited amount of freedom that women have during that time. And then she also uses the word black whale, which I found quite interesting as well. So the black whale kind of signifies the patriarchal adversities inflicted upon women. So for example, women are kind of expected to follow this veiled culture and not being able to express themselves. So the idea of a veil, which could be debatable, but it's kind of seen as the picture of how they're not able to express themselves rather than the fact that they're oppressed because of the veil, if you understand what I mean. And then one emphasis on the last part of the poem. So at the end, she says, I have spread my sails in the open wind on the wide seas. Here, Riaz, the poet, has constructed a new identity for women emerging from their suppressed origins, and it's kind of showing a sense of freedom, even though, like in the environment that they are right now, even though the struggles we do seem to continue, but now we have more mention about them, and we have more women are able to talk about them more freely. So we see when she says when she uses the phrase spread the sail, she signifies kind of the stance women are taking in a form of resistance due to the struggles that they have faced. Basically breaking the chains of oppression and deprivation. So now that we have kind of looked over just her poem, I think it kind of signifies a lot more of in the contemporary period, especially the beginning, how things have evolved. So I wanted to kind of in terms of the contemporary context, kind of relate this back to the modern society we live in now, since the 1960s, obviously. So we know that even though from now I would say that it has improved much more, but depending on obviously where. But if we look into the context of, for example, Quebec, now we might say that yes, women have obviously spoken up about more their issues, and there's a bit more, like I would say freedom, and they're able to express themselves in public spheres. But if I were to take the situation now, for example, the Quebec Law Bill 21, which is now Law 21, in case people don't know, it is a law that prohibits Quebec citizens who work in public spheres from wearing religious symbols while fulfilling their civic duties. Well, yes, this law is kind of addressed to not just women, obviously, but we see that there is a specific minority that has been targeted because of this law, and that is specifically Muslim women who do wear the head covering, the hijab, and other forms of hijab. So from that we can see that since that is also like still in part of a study, we can see that because of this law, there's many Muslim women who, or just not just Muslim women, but not just Muslim women, but I'm going to focus on that because that's kind of like our main theme. But we see that because of this, they're not able to participate in certain jobs, certain careers that they're limited to. So it's quite interesting to see how from the beginning of the contemporary era to now, we still have women struggling to be able to participate fully in the public sphere.
My question for you, Rameen, is the poem that you recited is kind of like the darkest in terms of themes, and it really kind of reflects that women are going through a lot of difficulties. And I was wondering if you think that this shows that there has been sort of a decline in women's position in society, or if you think that rather it's more so that women now have a means to express that their difficulties more freely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you brought that up. I also noticed that myself. We see that in my poem. It's seen as like women are struggling a lot, and like it seems like they have the worst really compared to, let's say, the previous eras, which is obviously the opposite. It's just that now women are able to, like we can see at the beginning of the contemporary period, women are now able to express themselves more and express not just, there's their emotions, like we have mentioned, or their like the mention of their physical attributes and stuff like that. But now we really see women kind of walking away from that physical. It's just women talking about just their issues and their struggles in society that they are in. So now I think, like for example, Famina, she's able to really just talk about her issues just freely, and like in her poem we see just her talking about just that. So it seems like, yeah, is this because women are having more struggles, or but I think that it's actually the opposite. It's just she's just able to express herself compared to, for example, poems that you guys have mentioned where there's some mention of women here and there, but it's like their emotion or their talk about them through, like for example, how Andrew mentioned, there was they mostly talk about like their husbands, or it's like their, or how for Aleena, like her poet kind of goes with a pen name, a male pen name, I think she mentioned. So it's more, now it's not just like, now women are just speaking as women about their issues and just fully going on about it. So I think that's why it gives it more of a dark perspective. But other than that, I think in terms of that, it has improved quite a lot.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Please make sure to listen to the other episodes in Good Morning Isla 200, and see you next time. Bye.
This podcast was prepared by the Fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.